I'm really looking forward to this one. This is the last of the events I've been directly involved in organising. This is kind of takes me back to the beginning of the pandemic, because obviously we had the West Indian team come over to England, despite the fact that there wasn't at that point much the coronavirus in the Caribbean, and there was a lot of coronavirus in England. And the kind of a different perspective of the primarily pro-England coverage you'd get through Sky and the British newspapers was the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, a fan-led podcast ran by British West Indian fans, talking about how they were seeing the game going, how they were seeing development in the Caribbean from a youthful perspective, not harking back all the time to the 1980s when the West Indies were the dominant test side. And so I'm really happy to be joined by Machel St Patrick Hewitt, who is one of the co-hosts of the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, to kind of talk about what it means to be a West Indian, to be a West Indian cricket fan in a 21st century British context. So over to you, Machel. If anybody has any questions, please post them in the Q&A, please post them in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end of the talk. Over to you, Machel.
Thank you very much, Will, and welcome everybody to this talk. Just to further echo what Will said, I'm fairly confident that there'll be some questions throughout the course of this. So by all means, do drop them in the chat. I can't guarantee I'll see them when you do drop them in, but I think at the end maybe I'll have a chance to address some. So if there are any questions out of anything that I say, by all means do feel free. As Will so eloquently put at the beginning, this talk is on West Indian cricket culture in the 21st century British context. My name is Machel St Patrick Hewitt, and I'm one half of the Caribbean Cricket Podcast. If you're listening to this and you already know about us, fantastic. If you don't, at the end of this talk, if you go to www.caribbeancricketpodcast.com, I'm fairly sure you can find everything you need to know on our website. But I just want to thank University of Wolverhampton for inviting me. And this topic is one, I guess, that is very close to my heart. And actually, we've been debating, myself and my co-host Santoki Nagalendran, whether we should do a podcast episode on this. So we'll see how this goes. And this may well spawn a more in-depth podcast episode. But today, what I'm going to do in light of Black History Month is look at the West Indian cricket culture in the modern day context. I think if you're a cricket fan or if you know anything about the West Indies, more often than not, if you look at media coverage of the West Indies, it covers what we refer to as the glory years of West Indies cricket, effectively the 15-year period between 1980 to 1995, where they did not lose a test series to any other nation that plays cricket in the world. And there's a myriad of names that I could throw out there for want of, with no disrespect to anyone that I miss out, but a Viv Richards, a Clive Lloyd, Joel Garner, Curtly Ambrose, and I could go on and on. There's a myriad of names that everybody associates with that period in time. But what is less spoken about is what that cricket culture means now. If you're a cricket fan, you should very much know that the West Indies aren't very good anymore, and that's putting it kindly. We're at best we're average. Maybe every now and again we're very good, but generally speaking, our record since the turn of the century has been exceptionally poor. And with that decline, I would argue, has led to a decline in a decline in the connection between the modern day Black British man, woman, child, whatever it might be, and the West Indies cricket team. But I'm going to try and extrapolate that over the course of this talk and try to give a deeper understanding about why that might be. But before I get there, the first thing I really want to do is just kind of give an outline for those who don't know me or who are new to this or just saw this come up on whatever social media platform, just give you an idea of who I am. So I was born in Kingston, Jamaica, and not everybody knows that. The accent might fool you, but I was born in Jamaica. I am very much the grandson of Windrush descendants. Both my grandfathers and grandmother, one grandfather on one side and grandmother and grandfather on the other side came over to the UK in the 50s, early 60s. So I'm very much a grandson of Windrush descendants. My immediate family, and by that I mean my mother, my father, my sister, and myself, we came to England when I was 3 years old. I then went back to Jamaica to do A-levels. So between the age of 16 and 18, I lived in Jamaica again. And I would add at this stage, because it's quite important to the story, that between the age of 3 to 16, I would argue that I was in Jamaica nearly every year of my life to visit family, or most of my extended family live in Jamaica or live in the United States. After doing A-levels in Jamaica, I returned to the UK to do university, the University of Warwick. My parents did not return. They still live in Jamaica in a place called Mandeville. Some of you may or may not be familiar. And currently, as well as hosting and founding the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, I actually do work in education, albeit at the secondary school level, and I'm an assistant vice principal at a secondary school in South London. That said, my approach to this talk is possibly not one that is more suited to higher education. I'm so used to talking to any children between the age of 11 to 18 that don't be surprised if the way I've presented these slides is with that in mind, more so than what you might expect from a higher education presentation. But I do hope I've gone in depth into the topics all the same. So in order to put this in deeper perspective, I've kind of given you the background of who I am, but I think I wanted to show some pictures to kind of develop this a bit further, because you have the title on the screen, West Indian Cricket Culture in the 21st Century, British Context, but I don't believe I can tell that story, or I don't believe I can adequately explain this modern day context without going back first. And the very first picture you see on the screen for me is very, very apt. That's my grandfather on my father's side passport. And the date on it, I don't know if you can make it out, but I've written it if you can't. It says the 20th of March, 1953. And that's his passport with which he travelled into the UK in 1953 as part of that Windrush generation. My grandfather is in the second and the third picture, a man by the name of Mr. Edgar Pope Hewitt. And God rest his soul, he has passed away. And it's quite interesting to me that when we found this passport, my dad sent the picture to me that we'd found his passport. And if you look closely at the passport, of course, the first thing you'll actually see is British passport, Jamaica. And I thought it was just quite apt to have that image to start everything off in light of the travesty that has taken place with many of the Windrush generation in the last 10 years, and everything that has come out with regards to papers being lost and people being sent home, etc. And in the context of all that, I often look back at this picture of my granddad's passport and wonder what would have happened if he was still alive. Because we can't find his papers, but we do know they had a British passport. Because for those who know your history, of course, many of those, if not all of those who travelled over in the Windrush generation, travelled on British passports, travelled as British citizens. And yet today we're dealing with a travesty whereby so many were told that they weren't British citizens, despite documentation saying otherwise. So we came over, as I indicated earlier on, in the early 80s, and I was 3 years old. And my dad had got a job over here, but part of also coming over here was to reconnect with my grandfather. And my grandfather, and this isn't a dissimilar tale to many of the Windrush generations, my grandfather had lost contact with our family back home. And my dad came over here. In fact, my dad was born after my grandfather had left to come to the UK. And my dad and all of us, we came over here to reconnect with him and reestablish that connection. And when we found him, and this is my perspective as a young boy at the time, when we found him, he wasn't living in the best of situations. Life had certainly taken its toll on him. I often remember that I used to go around to his house on a regular basis on a weekend. And I often look back and say that I think my grandfather tried to reconnect with me more than anybody else. And maybe I'm wrong, but I felt like it was his shot at some kind of redemption and to make up for losing his contact with his family back in Jamaica. And he would often tell me tales of what he had experienced in Britain when he came over here, in particular, the depth of racism that he had experienced. And the third picture is my sister. I thought I should include my sister as well. It's not just about me, but the third picture is myself and my sister with my grandfather in the latter part of the 80s. And then on the right-hand side is actually my uncle. And that's my uncle and myself just before COVID hit. That's October 2019 when I was last in Jamaica. And my uncle and I, we took a visit to my grandfather on my uncle's side. So my other grandfather who had passed away shortly before 2019. And that's his house in a place called Daverton in Manchester in Jamaica. And they too, it's important that I kind of indicate that they too had come over to the UK in the late 50s, early 60s, and then returned home to live in what we call country in Jamaica. And I think I put all these pictures together to kind of give a context to the story that I'm painting here, because for not necessarily, I wouldn't say a lot now, but for many British Caribbeans, we have a story or a tale that may or may not be familiar to this. And certainly we have family who, if we go far enough back in our family tree, have a tale that can probably reflect a story similar to this. But then how this then ties into cricket is as follows. And I have to give a lot of credit to my dad here, because my dad was responsible for passing on what I call the oral tradition, the oral history of West Indies cricket. And when putting the slides together, I was thinking, well, what are the images that best reflect or best evoke my experience as a black male watching watching the West Indies cricket team whilst living in the UK? And certainly in the early 90s, and at this point now, I'm just about to enter secondary school. And there were two kind of individuals and two images that I associate with my earliest memories of the West Indies cricket team. For those of you who are big on your cricket history, you'll certainly know the ground, and I'd like to think you'll know the individual. And the individual there is Vivian Richards, and that's him walking out at the Oval for his very last innings in Test cricket. And when I think back through my history, watching Viv Richards in that test is one of the earliest memories I have. And I can even now, as I'm talking to you, picture Viv walking off the field after he'd been dismissed as his very final innings in Test cricket. I was possibly 11 at the time, 10 or 11 at the time. And even without understanding the aura and the real history of Viv Richards, it was clear when he walked off that field what indelible mark he had left, not just on West Indies cricket, but wider cricket as a whole. So I tend to, when I look back at West Indies cricket in my formative years, I associate it with Viv Richards first and foremost. And for those who don't know his record, I think it's worth evoking that now. 121 test matches and a test match average of 50.23, 8,540 runs. And of course, he often referred to with the moniker of the Master Blaster. At the end of that 1991 series in England, Viv Richards retired along with Gordon Greenidge, Geoffrey Dujon and Malcolm Marshall. And at the time, that was very much the end of one era of West Indies cricket. But then the second image I have, and at this time now I'm possibly approaching 14, 15. The next image that came to mind was Brian Lara. So 4 years later, West Indies returned to England in 1995. And the Prince of the Port of Spain, Brian Lara, was very much his team at this stage. He was the new prince of West Indies cricket. Much like Viv, his record is peerless in Test cricket. 131 matches, Test match average of 52.88, and he's the highest run scorer in West Indies cricket history, 11,953 runs. But the reason why I put up Viv and I put up Brian Lara isn't just because they're the two individuals I kind of link to my earliest memories of West Indies cricket, But it's quite interesting. I started off this slide, and I started off this talk with me talking about my upbringing and being Jamaican and being the grandson of Windrush, of the Windrush generation. But what's quite interesting here is neither Viv nor Brian Lara were Jamaican. But to me, they were heroes. To me, they were just as much West Indian to me or Jamaican to me as anybody else in that team. I didn't look at the West Indies team as who on that team is my Jamaican hero. That never crossed my mind. It didn't matter to me which island or which country these individuals were representing within the Caribbean. The identity was very much a wider West Indian identity. And it's quite important that I stress that. And at the same time, it was also about, in the context of Black History Month, it was also about Black pride. It was about seeing Black individuals on a big stage dominating in their field. Call it Black excellence, call it what you may, call it what you want, but it was also a source of pride to see both Viv and Brian in their pomp dominating in this particular field. And it's important to raise that, and I talk about the early 90s because I think we have to go back to the early 90s to remember what it was like. And it might feel like a long, long time ago, but the images that I've gone for remind you that it wasn't. I shouldn't have to talk about the images on the board, but on the slides, there's the teacher in me. On the right-hand side, that's a riot in Brixton as a result of the death in custody of Black males, or one Black male, I should say. Stephen Lawrence, that story needs no introduction. And of course, John Barnes kicking a banana off the pitch in 1988. And the reason why I just use those three random images to kind of evoke why cricket and the West Indies team was important to a young me in the early 90s. They represented a connection to home. Now, you could argue that I was Jamaican born, so maybe my connection to home was stronger than it might be to another Black male or female who was born here, but the West Indies represented a connection to home. But why was that connection to home important? If I look at the third bullet point, because often in the late 80s, well, for those who are older than me, all the way through 60s, 70s, 80s, early 90s, to be Black was to be a criminal. And I was gonna, on this slide, I was gonna put up numerous newspaper headlines to make this point, but I think the images itself kind of evoke the point that I'm making here. Black skin was criminalized in the early 90s and all of the 80s, all of the 70s, all of the 60s. So there was a link to the West Indies team that made you feel like that was home, because growing up in the UK in the early 90s did not feel like home. As I alluded to in the earlier slide, at the time, in the early 90s, the West Indies still hadn't been defeated in a test series. So they also represented Black excellence. They represented something you could look to, or look towards, I should say, with immense pride. So the development of a West Indian cricket culture in the early 90s, or sorry, I always say early 90s because I'm talking about myself, but the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, it writes itself, because as a young Black male or a female growing up in the UK, then a link needed to be made to something that allowed you to feel a sense of pride. For myself in particular, this is a picture of my secondary school. You probably can't, well, you probably can read it actually, but that's my year 11 picture in 1998. So what's that now? Oh, I'm getting old. That's 23 years ago. So that's my year 11 picture in 1998. And it shouldn't be too hard to find me. I was going to give you a second, but it shouldn't be too hard to find me on that screen. And I think the reason why I bring this picture up is to link to the points that I'm trying to make. That's near the turn of the century. And for my entire schooling, when I went to school in the school I went to was in South London. For my entire schooling, I was pretty much the only Black face I saw. between the age of 11 to the age of 16. There was one other black student in my year group, and across the whole school, between the age of 11 to 16, there were only 5 black boys in the entire school. Obviously, the school was an all-boys school. And for me and my upbringing, that's why the link to West Indies cricket was even more important. We talk about this being Black History Month. I never heard the words Black History in the entire time I was at school. No one spoke about it. If anything, if I go back to visit year 11 me, I'd argue that I didn't even know what Black history was, or that it was even a thing, because it was never mentioned. My identity, and I did an assembly, actually, I did an assembly in school, not too dissimilar to what I'm talking about here without mentioning cricket, where I said to the students that actually I probably had an identity crisis when I was going through the UK school system, because I never saw anyone that looked like me. That didn't mean I didn't know who I was, but I never saw anybody that looked like me beyond my family and beyond the times when we went back to Jamaica to visit family. So that ties into the West Indies cricket team and West Indian cricket culture, because they, in essence, showed me that I should have pride in who I am. Brian Lara didn't speak to me personally. Carl Hooper didn't speak to me personally. Jimmy Adams didn't speak, well, actually Jimmy did, but Jimmy Adams didn't speak to me personally. But seeing them on the screen whenever they came to England to play in a test series or an ODI series or whatever it might be, that gave me an immense sense of Black pride to see them succeeding on the TV screen. And it allowed me to feel like it was okay to be a Black male. But we can't really, or I can't really paint what it means now in 2021 in the modern day context without still continuing to look backwards. And these 3 images are quite important for me. The image on the left is, again, those of you who are watching this who are cricket historians or cricket buffs, I reckon you'll recognize most of these images. The image on the left is 1976, again at the Oval. This is after the West Indies had beaten England 3-0. And that was a series where I think Tony Gregg said he was going to make the West Indies grovel. And the West Indies won that series 3-0. And what's quite interesting is in the crowd, you can see lots and lots of Black faces. The next image is the 1984 Blackwash series, where West Indies beat England 5-0. And again, you see, not only do you see Black faces in the crowd, but you actually see banners. And if any of you go back and watch you go and watch images or clips, I should say, of those series, they're the one thing that both of them often show is crowds of Black men and Black women running onto the field after another West Indian victory to go and crowd their heroes in glory. The image on the right, however, is 2017. I believe it's in Manchester. I think Alistair Cook hit a double century. And that's the last time West Indies came here when crowds were allowed to go and watch cricket. And England went on to win that series. And that's a snapshot. I've taken that picture, and it's a snapshot of Alistair Cook raising his back to the crowd. And if you look at that picture, you cannot see one Black face anywhere in the picture. Now, yes, somebody could say to me, oh, but that's just a snapshot. But when you compare it to the other 2 images, you're not having to squint to find somebody who may be of Caribbean extract. In the 2017 picture, no matter how hard you squint, you'll find nobody there. And to me, that, or those 3 images almost indicate a shift in this culture in the modern context. And that scene is not a one-off. And I'll give some further examples later on, but they are not one-off scenes in 2017. It is very much the exception to the rule to see a big West Indian gathering if the West Indies come over to play England in the modern day context. And what we have to kind of try and identify, and what I'm going to do over the remainder of this talk, is try and look at why is that the case. Some talk about socio-economic factors, some talk about a cultural disconnect, some talk about the loss of a West Indian identity, but I'm going to try and unpick why what we saw in the 70s and the 80s and even the early 90s, why has that effectively disappeared when we talk about West Indian cricket culture in the modern era? Now, one of the people I recommend you all go and read in order to understand this further is a gentleman by the name of Hilary Beckles. And there's two particular texts that I recommend you read, and I'll talk about them at the end. But one of them is reading a chapter that Hilary wrote on what he calls the detachment of West Indies cricket. But what Hilary does, Hilary Beckles, sorry, is the Vice Chancellor of the University of West Indies, as well as being an all-round cricket buff. Now, what Hilary does is, first and foremost, he goes back as well to set the context of what the West Indies team meant in the 80s. And I don't want to read out for you what it says on the screen, but I guess I will. And Hilary says, by 1980, the West Indians were dominant in the international game. They were able to sustain this status for near 20 years. In no other area of public engagement did the West Indians achieve a commanding presence in the international arena. In the hands of West Indians, furthermore, the game was ideologically restructured and energized to serve a purpose bigger than itself, the struggle for social justice and political freedom. West Indian supporters are generally foot soldiers of this collective historical consciousness and future expectation. In each island, the game has been asked to carry a greater emotional and political burden than in other places. Here, therefore, it is not just a game. It is the heartbeat of a young nation looking into an old world, searching for a place where dignity and honor can be assured. Now, I agree with that, but I agree with that in so much as that is applicable to the West Indian generation that came post-Windrush in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. And you'll see at the top of the screen I put, it's the first wave of migration and their kids. They're the ones who fit that description that Hilary Beckles is talking about. They're the ones who saw West Indies cricket as serving a purpose bigger than itself. They're the ones where West Indies cricket talks about searching for a place where dignity and honor can be assured, particularly in the post-colonial world. It's worth remembering that for all of the Caribbean islands / countries, independence came in the 60s and onwards. So we have to look at this in the post-colonial context as well. Hilary then continues to say, but nowhere was the politics of West Indian cricket more emotionally felt than among the West Indian migrants in England in the aftermath of Frank Worrell's appointment in the early 60s. Cricket success was their most reliable armor in the struggle for social respect, dignity, and general well-being in the slums of inner cities. Cricket victories revived and enlivened the politics of decolonization and identity they had left behind in the West Indies. And again, I think that gives you further context. But again, I apply what Hilary Beckles is saying there is applicable to the first wave of West Indian migrants. I would argue that that description no longer applies to the current West Indian generation. And part of it for me boils down to the fact that we're one generation further on. You have the West Indian migrants who come in the 50s and 60s, some with their kids, some not with their kids. And when I talk about, and I count my dad as part of this because my grandfather came over in the 50s, my dad and my family came over to look for him, granted, in the 80s. But it's worth pointing out that my dad and my mother came over from Jamaica itself. So there was a link to, and in this sense, I talk about the motherlanders being back home in the Caribbean. There was a link that couldn't be scratched out. There was a need to still connect with the homeland. So I think my context is slightly different to what the majority of West Indians may feel in the modern day context. And the kind of critique I pose here is that maybe that oral tradition and that sense that Hilary Beckles talks about of an identity left behind in the West Indies, for the current modern day generation, I would argue that that identity is gone. It's not left behind. It was never there to begin with, but I'll get into that further. It's also worth pointing out, and this is to further develop on Hilary Beckles' argument, for the post-Windrush generation, this was the Britain they grew up in. Again, I'd like to believe you know all of these images, but I didn't say at the start what I teach in schools. I teach history and politics. I should point out as well. But I'd like to think for those listening, you're familiar with some of these images. So you have the no Irish, no blacks, no dogs, and that's talking about the housing discrimination that the West Indian generation, Windrush generation experienced when they came over here. The second picture is the Bristol bus boycott, which not many people know about. Actually, it's worth, if you don't know about that and you're listening to this, I do recommend you go and read up about it, because sometimes when we talk about Black history, there's almost like a feeling that Black history means civil rights history in the United States, without understanding that there is very much a UK Black history. And that's why when I talk about the Bristol bus boycott, I often find that people don't know they even existed. But similar to the Montgomery bus boycott in 1958 in the United States, a similar bus boycott took place in Bristol in 1963. Blacks and Asians were not being employed by a particular Bristol bus company. And as a result, the communities in Bristol boycotted until that law was changed. The gentleman in the third picture should need no introduction, the infamous Enoch Powell. If you've not revisited that speech, one, I wouldn't recommend it, but for historical posterity, it might be worth going back to revisit that speech by Enoch Powell. Because in 1968, Enoch Powell, a then Conservative member of Parliament, possibly whilst agitating to reach the higher rungs of the Conservative Party, whilst appealing to right-wing sentiment. And as I say that, part of me feels like the more things change, the more they stay the same. But Enoch Powell in his speech said, in 20 to 30 years, the Black man will have the whip hand over the white man. He said that in 1968. He was sacked, I hasten to add, from the Conservative Party for that. But I more make that point to talk about the level of racial discrimination that the Windrush generation experienced when they arrived in the UK. And then on the far right picture there, you have an image from the Brixton riots in 1981. Now, the reason I bring those four images up is because that racial context and that overt racism that the Windrush generation experienced made it easier for the development of a West Indian identity and a West Indian nationhood in the UK. That made it easier to draw a direct line and a direct correlation to not just West Indian identity, but the West Indies cricket team. And I go back to the words of Hilary Beckles. Cricket victories revived and enlivened the politics of decolonisation and identity they had left behind in the West Indies. And at the top, nowhere was the politics of West Indian cricket more emotionally felt than among the West Indian migrants in England. You add the context of racial discrimination and the birth of what then became, under Viv Richards, in essence, actually an all-Black West Indian team, and you get the development of a West Indian identity and nationhood in the UK, and a link to home more so than the UK. And I make the distinction here between what I see as a Black Caribbean identity and a Black British identity. I could probably go into that in more depth, but that's for a different talk on another day. Then we fast forward to Viv Richards. Now, Viv Richards wrote an autobiography, but Viv Richards' autobiography, Hitting Across the Line, published in 1991. When Viv Richards was captain of the West Indies, they did not lose a test series to anybody. That was between the years of 1983 to 1991. So when Viv retired, he retired as an unbeaten West Indies test captain over 50 test matches. All those series they were undefeated. Now, Viv said this: I believe very strongly in the Black man asserting himself in this world, coming as I do from the West Indies at the end of the colonial era. I identify with Black power, Rastafarian, and all the movements of Black liberations. Once I was offered $1 million to play cricket in South Africa, I could not go, as long as the Black majority in South Africa remains oppressed by the apartheid system. I could never come to terms with playing cricket there. I would be letting down my own Black people and I would destroy my sense of self-esteem. Cricket has always been politics, and especially for us in the Caribbean. Again, if you haven't read Viv's autobiography, go and give it a read, but I pick out that line as quite key, because when Viv Richards was captain of the West Indies team, more than at any other time in West Indies cricket history, there was an idea of Black nationalism. Viv was for those who know, Viv was a very outspoken leader of West Indies cricket. And he saw, as he says, cricket as political and as a unifying force for Black people. So again, I say, you can't really look at West Indian cricket culture in the modern day context without looking back, and this is in the 90s or 80s/90s, and understand how entrenched the West Indies cricket team was to the West Indian migrant culture in the British context. And that's why when I put up those images of West Indians flooding the Oval in 76, flooding the Oval in 84, it makes sense. Because when you look at the discourse that existed in the 80s and the 90s around the West Indies cricket team, it makes sense that there would be a strong Black identity around the West Indian cricket team. So then we have to think about, well, what's changed? What's changed in the here and now? I've been reading quite a lot, so I'm not going to read this one to you. I'm just going to summate it. But Hilary Beckles, going back to Hilary Beckles again, he makes the point with this quote here, and I'll let you read it for yourselves. But he basically makes the point here that the West Indian identity has been lost at the turn of the century. And he talks about the fact that within the Caribbean itself, there is no idea of a West Indian identity across the islands. And in fact, if anything, due to the mass poverty, the mass unemployment, police brutality, the endemic violence across some of the Caribbean islands and countries, it's fostered the notion within the Caribbean of, well, what has my nation or what has my country done for me? So when you're questioning authority in that way, you can't find a shared unity. Because now, for individuals within the Caribbean, and then this is Hilary Beckles' argument, the enemy, so to speak, is their own nation, is their own government. And he argues that's why there's no longer a sense of a shared West Indian identity. Now, I'm not sure where I stand on that. I'm just throwing that out there for you to consider. And certainly what I would say is that argument doesn't cross over to why there is no longer a kind of longing and feeling for the West Indies team in the modern British context now. But that's what Hilary Beckles argues is the reason in the Caribbean context. And I wanted that to be there just so we could juxtapose that with what I feel is the argument in the British context. Now, specifically looking at the British context, sorry for the pixelated picture, to understand now, and as finally I get to the crux, but to understand where West Indian cricket culture lies now in the modern day context, you have to start here. I've only just realized how often the Oval comes up in these stories. Sorry about that. I literally just realized now that this is the 4th time I've mentioned the Oval. And maybe it's the fact I live in South London, I don't know. But this is Curtly Ambrose and Courtney Walsh. It seems like West Indian cricketers make a habit of retiring at the Oval. But this is Curtly Ambrose and Courtney Walsh retiring. Well, Courtney didn't actually retire, but this was them retiring as a pace attack, like the fearsome twosome. This was their kind of formal retirement. And Curtly retired and Courtney retired a few months later or a few series later. But the reason why I bring this picture up is because this, for me, marked the end of an era. This was the year 2000, and England beat the West Indies 3-1. And I remember watching this. I would have been, I think maybe I was 18. I remember watching this and even acknowledging at the time we're finished. It was the first time West Indies had looked completely vulnerable to England. It was the first time I'd seen us lose to England in a test series. And we lost and we lost badly. And this marks the end of an era, because from this point onwards in the year 2000, the West Indies basically stopped winning. In fact, I'll give you the stats now. Ricky Skerritt, who's the current president of Cricket West Indies, he made this speech in, I'm going to say a year and a half ago, and it was the Sir Frank Worrell Memorial Lecture. And Ricky Skerritt just said the following: Sir Frank Worrell would be disappointed to find that of the 194 test matches played by West Indies in the past 20 years alone, they've lost 104. They've only won 41, which is 21%. In the same period, we've only won 32% of the ODIs we've played and 45% of the T20 internationals we've played. In this same period since the year 2000, the West Indies have fallen to the bottom of the ICC rankings in every format of the game. Now, it's important that I talk about the stats, because now I present the different arguments for why you could argue the West Indian cricket culture has declined so badly in the modern day context. One, we're not very good. So the first argument is the fact the West Indies cricket team very rarely wins matches is the number one reason why there is no longing or desire to watch the West Indies cricket team for the modern day Black British male, female, Black Caribbean, however they may identify themselves. The second argument, or third and fourth, that I would bring is that this generation, this Caribbean, I'm focusing specifically on Black Caribbean, this isn't an influx generation. So the Windrush generation was a politicized generation. The current 2021 Black generation, which makes up only 1.1% of the UK population, and I say only for a reason, actually, and this comes from the 2011 census, by the way, and we are due another census, but it often surprises me how news is presented on Black Britain or Black Caribbeans as if there are lots of us. There really isn't. We make up 1.1% of the UK population, which equates to about 0.6 million. So this generation, this modern day generation, they're not coming from home. And I say home because I was born in Jamaica. This is a generation that has grown up exclusively here. And that's why I kind of made a distinction earlier on between being Black British and being Black Caribbean. Now, that's my own personal opinion. I'm not saying there is any line in an encyclopedia where you can read about this, but I would argue that culturally there may well be a difference. Black households, 55%, are most likely out of all the ethnic groups to have a weekly income of less than £600. And the reason I make that point is it brings us to the socio-economic argument. Has there been a decline in support or desire to go and watch the West Indies when they are in England? Because financially, it's not something people can afford. It's certainly an argument, but then whenever I've discussed this with my co-host on the podcast, Santoki, we often say, well, when Bangladesh travel here or when Pakistan travel here, I'm not saying India, because if you look at the weekly income, technically it wouldn't correlate to the Indian community. But when Bangladesh come here or when Pakistan come here, you will see the crowds packed. So there is a disconnect with the Black Caribbean community in the UK and the West Indies cricket team. And of course, in the context of Black Lives Matter last year, 2020, when suddenly a lot of people seemingly found a consciousness, data came out that a study had been carried out by Leeds Beckett University that there was only 9 Black players competing in county cricket in 2019. Depending on how old you are, of the people who are watching here, you should need no reminder that in the 80s, it would be unheard of to not see every single county team have a West Indian cricketer of immense talent. Now, this study in 2019 states that only 9 Black players were in county cricket in general. And again, rather than that being necessarily just a socio-economic argument, the argument I would make there is maybe cricket just isn't a sport that attracts the UK Black, British, Black Caribbean community anymore. You could argue that maybe cricket has excluded the Black Caribbean community, but it doesn't seem to be a game that attracts my community anymore. And with that, If that's the case, yes, that's in the British context, but if you're not even playing cricket, why would you find, or why would there be a connection to the West Indies cricket team? And then I thought I'd develop it a bit further, seeing how I am for time. Oh gosh, I forgot to warn people that when I start talking, I don't know how to stop, but don't worry, I'll soon stop. But then I thought, let me give a bit more context. So the school that I work in, I did a survey in my school the other day. So my school, like I say, is in South London. It's actually a 15-minute walk from Kent County Cricket's ground in Beckenham. So Kent play in Canterbury, and they occasionally play in Beckenham as well. So my school is 15 minutes walk from there. Approximately, my school has 18 to 20% students of Black Caribbean origin. And when I say origin, as in that's how they would tick the form when they come into the school. I carried out a study with those students in my school, 20%, and I asked them the following questions. I said, who has ever heard of the game cricket before from their parents? Who has been to watch cricket? Who cares cricket exists? And who follows the West Indies? And you'll think I'm lying, but every single student answered in the negative to those questions. Some of them didn't even know the West Indies cricket team was a thing. But what was more interesting to me, and probably was the more pertinent answer, was all of them said their parents had never mentioned it to them. And that's important to me because it speaks to the removal of the oral tradition. West Indies cricket was passed down to me by my father. For a lot of West Indians, it was passed down. There was the link couldn't be etched out. But for this generation, and like I say, that's just a snapshot of the school I work in, but it's a quite big snapshot, quite big study. None of them knew anything about cricket, much less West Indies cricket. And again, as I've alluded to in previous slides, I wonder if this speaks to the development of what now is a Black British generation. And that's not a bad thing, by the way. I'm not saying that, oh my gosh, we should do something about this. But is it a case where we have a Black British generation that has a Caribbean heritage, but doesn't see the Caribbean as home? And I draw a line between that and a Black Caribbean generation. And that's the generation who I think see the Caribbean as home, who still go to the Caribbean, still see their family ties as belonging to the Caribbean. And I just wonder if there is a dividing line which explains why the West Indian cricket culture is no longer embedded within the Caribbean community. I give away my age now. I've been trying not to, but I'm 39 years old. If anybody was wondering, oh, I thought you were younger than that, thank you. But I'm 39 years old. And I've often said to my co-host on the podcast, Santoki, that there is a dividing line within the Black Caribbean community. And I think, I don't know if my age is the cutoff point, but it's somewhere close. I've always argued that 35 and above is the end of the generation of Black Caribbeans who may have grown up here, but have still got a link, but still have a link to home that has not been wiped out. And it's under 35 where you see a massive dwindling of numbers who see any kind of connection to West Indies cricket. And if they do, and they're under 35, that will undoubtedly be because their parents have still carried on that oral tradition. And I kind of link, therefore, to the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, which is a case study in all of this. When myself and Santoki created the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, the whole reason we created it was because of ultimately this talk that I'm doing today. I happened to find Santoki on Twitter. Isn't life an amazing thing? I happened to find him on Twitter. And how did we find each other? Because both of us responded to a thread talking about the disappearance of the Black Caribbean community vis-a-vis West Indies cricket. We got chatting. Before you knew it, we'd met up in a Costa Coffee in Dalston Junction, and we started talking about our shared experience. Santoki is Guyanese. He was big on cricket, but he'd never played cricket. He never played at his comprehensive school. He had no kind of founding in cricket other than his mother, his Guyanese mother, passing on the oral tradition of the Rowan Kanais, of the Kallicharrans. His mother had passed on that oral tradition. And in fact, I remember Santoki saying to me that he felt like an outcast within his immediate community because nobody spoke about cricket, but his mother had passed it on. Similarly for me, my father had passed it on. I felt it as an indelible link that couldn't be etched out, connecting me to home. So we created the Caribbean Cricket Podcast. Initially, it was about, well, let's try and make sure we can revive the West Indian cricket culture in the modern day context. But what's been fascinating to us is how hard it has been to find that Black Caribbean community. And don't get me wrong, some of them have gravitated towards the podcast, but it's shown us that there aren't many out there. We tried to reach out to Black cricket clubs that may still exist in the Caribbean. There aren't that many out there, in the UK, there aren't that many out there. If anything, what's been more fascinating is and I use the word loosely, fan base of the podcast is more so people within the UK who grew up admiring what the West Indies cricket team did from different ethnic backgrounds. Within the UK itself, when I talk about the Black Caribbean community, they're few and far between in terms of those that have gravitated towards podcasts. I'd love to believe that maybe there's a community out there that just don't know we exist yet. But what I likely believe it is that the community that don't know we exist are on the older side. That's what I think, that's what our research is showing us. And in fact, our actual biggest audience is the diaspora community in the United States. They're the ones who listen to us the most. So it talks about, that really shows that there is a disconnect that's happened in the UK diaspora. I talk about my Essex and Kent experience in 2017, because the last time the West Indies came over here, I went to watch West Indies play 2 tour matches. They played Essex in Chelmsford and Kent at Canterbury. And I went there, and across both grounds, the number of Black Caribbeans I saw, I could count on 2 hands across both grounds. And it felt embarrassing. I remembered being at the Essex game, the Kent game, and I was looking around and I couldn't even see anybody. I couldn't see anybody that looked like me until I saw sounds disparaging, but I saw a little old lady, and I went over to her, a Caribbean lady. I went over to her, and her and I got chatting. She was like 70 something. And her and I got chatting about the history of West Indies cricket. And we were the only 2 Caribbeans in the ground that day. And that says a lot. Now, the reason I've put racism hasn't gone away is because I think it's important that earlier on I spoke about, well, of course, there was an identity to West Indies cricket because the Windrush generation came over here and the racism was endemic in the country. But racism's never gone away. It's never gone away in the UK. It might be more insidious, it might be more hidden. It's never actually gone away. And if anything, you could argue we're back to living in intolerant times in the UK. So the Black struggle hasn't disappeared. So I don't want to make this out to be that there was a link to West Indies cricket in the past because of the struggle that Black people faced in the UK. The struggle never disappeared. So it can't just be about racism. That can't be the reason why the link to the West Indian cricket culture has declined in the 21st century. So it brings me back to my point and my overarching point I've been trying to make through this. There has been I've called it a cricket cultural disconnect. It could be that it's just because the team doesn't win anymore. It could be that. But supporting the West Indies was about more. I would argue it was about more than just winning, because there's still a Black identity in there. And I would love to believe, and maybe I'm wrong, that Black identity can't just be intrinsically linked to winning all the time. But maybe that was the difference. Maybe it was because the West Indies were unbeaten for 15 years, and that sense of Black pride cannot be replicated. So where do we go from here? I'm actually going to finish. So where do we go from here? I found this really hard to answer because I don't have the answer. All I do know is this: the West Indies story and the West Indies cricket culture is part of Black Caribbean British history. And when we talk about this being Black History Month and the types of things we should talk about Black history, I don't see how you teach Black history without talking about the West Indies story. It's intrinsically connected to the Black Caribbean experience. If anything, what my talk shows is that the oral tradition is the key. You don't revive a West Indian culture in this country amongst the Black Caribbean community without the parents taking on. So, for example, I have a 3-year-old daughter. Now, I'm not saying she's going to love the West Indies team, but she already knows that I watch cricket. So whenever she's with me, and sports on, she's always like, "Are you going to watch the cricket?" And she already knows that when I'm watching cricket, it's the West Indies team. Now, that's not me trying to force that on her, but she's growing up in a household where that is my tradition. And similar to the way my father spoke to me about the Viv Richards and the Malcolm Marshalls is the same way. Well, I don't really have a Viv or a Malcolm to talk about. I mean, I don't have any heroes per se to talk about from my era, but it's the same way I'll talk about a Shivnarayan Chandapal or a Chris Gale or a Jason Holder or a Kimar Roach, as well as obviously the greats of the game. So the oral tradition is key. And ultimately, linking back to the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, that was the establishment and the foundation of that was an attempt to reignite the love affair. But it's important that I say inclusive of all who feel a connection. Yes, I've kind of the context for this talk has been in the context of Black History Month. That's not to exclude anybody else, because ultimately we created the podcast as a way to bring in everybody who felt some kind of connection to West Indian cricket. And I guess I end with the hashtag this month for Black History Month has been #ProudToBe. So I end by saying I'm proud to be a West Indies cricket fan in this modern day context. And I'm proud to be that because of the rich tapestry that they've woven through the Black Caribbean, let's call UK, the Black UK Caribbean experience. But more importantly, and this is where I end, it's about the tapestry they continue to weave. They may not be as great anymore, but their significance is still bigger than just being within the Caribbean. And finally, I end with this. If there's any England fans on here, I'm sure you're happy. But of course, there is a T20 World Cup going on at this moment in time, and West Indies were humbled by England on, what day was it? On Saturday, just gone. But there are 4 matches still to go, and I'll still be watching all of them, and I'll still be rallying around the West Indies till the bitter end. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone who's been part of this, and that has been my presentation.
A big thank you, Machel. Now, I wasn't going to mention the game on Saturday, and I must admit, before the game started, I was like, "Oh no, if England loses, it's going to be a very awkward introduction." But no, I mean, we are actually gone beyond time, but that was an excellent talk, really interesting. I would urge people to go listen to the Caribbean Cricket Podcast. Even if you're not a cricket fan, there's some really interesting discussions they have in their archives, including specials on, for example, the position of Indo-Caribbean people and players in the West Indian team and cricket culture, what happened to some of those Black West Indian cricket players who actually did take the offer to go and tour South Africa under apartheid, and what happened to, for the rest of their lives after being ostracised by many within the West Indian cricket team and wider society. And actually not on the Caribbean Cricket Podcast feed, but Machel guested on the Australian cricket journalist Jared Kimber's Red Inca podcast, talking about West Indian cricket culture, which actually has some really interesting insights into the Americanization of the West Indies when cable TV happened in the 80s. So there's so much interesting content. We'll take a couple of quick questions, but I know external engagement need their Zoom feedback, so we can't take too long. So just very quickly, we did have a question in the Q&A, which I think is actually really interesting, which I've not thought about before. Do you think the West Indies should make more of an effort to look at players of Caribbean origin who live outside the West Indies? So, British Caribbean or American Caribbean, Australian Caribbean, should they actually try and start using the grandfather, father kind of rules to actually start getting people qualified to play, rather than, let's say, England constantly steal players from the Caribbean?
Yeah, I'll quickly answer that one. And that's a very good question. The short answer is yes. And I'm going to use the example of the Jamaica football team, the Reggae Boys. So the Reggae Boys have very much used that. So the current Reggae Boys team has made overtures to and secured the services of Mikel Antonio. Now, Mikel Antonio, for example, is one of the top goal scorers in the English Premier League, up front for West Ham, but he is of Jamaican extract in terms of his parents and so on and so forth. And he has agreed and has already played one game for Jamaica in the World Cup qualifiers. To me, it's a no-brainer, because and it kind of underpins what I was saying in the talk. West Indian cricket culture is as much about those back home in the Caribbean as it is about the diaspora. And if you think of the podcast that we do, it's a diaspora podcast. Yes, I was born in Jamaica, but I've primarily grown up in the UK. Santoki, the co-host, grew up in the UK, but both of us indelibly feel an overarching link to the Caribbean. So I would argue that cricket, in terms of West Indies looking outwards, is probably a bit antiquated in its approach, and it's certainly something they could take advantage of.
Excellent. And we just had a mention in the chat about the special status the Oval had in West Indian cricket culture. That there is how talking about this in the 70s and 80s. That the series involved with the comments on the England cricket captain about grovelling is astonishing, because one of the things obviously cricket fans may know, but people who aren't cricket fans won't know, is that Tony Greig was South African born. So in the 70s, at the height of apartheid and the kind of the global awakening on the need to confront it, you've got a white South African-born English cricket captain with a very thick South African accent, talking about making entirely black side grovel, and incredibly insensitive, and he was made to eat those words.
Yeah, very, very much so. And yeah, as I kind of noted, I really didn't realize when I put the slides together that I'd mentioned the Oval about 17,000 times. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, it makes sense that the Oval is at the heart of the West Indian story, because of how big the West Indian community is, particularly in South London. But I'm going to do some further research on the Oval, because I think that's almost a talk in itself.
And then our final question: what would it take for Caribbean-born England players such as Chris Jordan or Jofra Archer to play for the West Indies?
I'm going to give two answers. Okay, the quote-unquote joke answer is for England to not poach them. That's the first thing. But the second answer is really and truly professionalization. And I didn't talk about that because I didn't think it fit this particular talk. But probably the biggest actual reason for the decline of the West Indies cricket team is everybody caught up with us in the 90s, and we fell behind when it came to professionalization of the cricket structure. So to keep the Jofra Archers, to keep the Chris Jordans, we just need to have a more professional structure throughout the Caribbean, which is of course difficult because it's a conglomeration of islands, and it's much harder to have the same system across those different islands and countries than it would be within one landmass like England.
And also it's expensive, like these are tourist islands, so it's like it's actually very expensive. You're flying people all over the Caribbean, and because those seats are high in demand. But big thank you again. It's been great. It's been a great talk. I've really enjoyed it. I think people have enjoyed it as well. And best of luck with all you do with the Caribbean Cricket Podcast. And you also do commentary with Guerrilla Commentary, and you do some football journalism as well. So where can people find you if they want to find out what you're up to?
Yeah, probably the best place, to be honest. If you want to find out about the podcast, www.caribbeancricketpodcast.com. But if you're somebody who's on like Twitter and Instagram, etc., then at Carib Cricket, 1R, and or at Mash St Paddy, which is my personal one. But whichever one you go to, I'm sure you'll find the podcast that way.
Excellent. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us. And remember to look at wlv.ac.uk/Black History Month for more information about forthcoming events. Thank you, everybody.